Hi there, this is Mrs. Hale. Just coming in to explain to you the World War II lecture notes if you happen to miss class for that day. With World War II lecture notes, it basically walks you through quite a bit of like the background to the war and then bringing you into Pearl Harbor. Now, with the attack on Pearl Harbor and other parts of this, I will share with you guys the video links that I have in the slides so that way you can view them if you would like. So starting off, how I would go ahead and write down your notes, okay, is just kind of things in the margins if you haven't picked up on that already. What you are doing is just jotting down things that I say, elaborating on what I've actually typed up for you, okay? So to start off, what you have here is looking at the foreign policy of the United States. And keep in mind, this is all before World War II. So we're looking at 1921 to 1933. We had from President Hoover this relative idea of isolation, but keep in mind, we're not really that isolated from Europe for a couple of reasons, namely, like the cartoon on the bottom right shows, namely because of war reparations. Keep in mind with the Dawes Plan, DAWES, with the Dawes Plan, you have the United States is loaning Germany money. Germany is using that money either to rebuild their infrastructure or to then also pay off their debts that they owe the other allied powers. And then the allied powers are paying back the United States as well what they owe us. So it's this triangle that really doesn't isolate us from Europe. For Japan and China, in 1931, Japan goes into Manchuria, which is a northern province of China. And what ends up happening, and like, how does Japan manage to do this? So keep in mind, during the 1920s, there was a series of naval power agreements, and I just kind of called them the Washington Naval Conference. And these different powers and the different treaties all were supposed to be reducing the amount of weapons and ships that countries have: Great Britain, United States, Japan, Germany, etc. And what ends up happening, though, is during this time period, Japan is rebuilding herself and starting to imperialize and take over other areas. And so Japan then goes into northern China looking basically for raw materials and oil. And so in September of 1931, they go into Manchuria and take control of it. Now, they ignored the open door policy through that attack, okay? And the League of Nations, though, does nothing virtually, okay? They condemn what Japan has done, but they take no action. And because of that, Japan's like, oh, no one's physically stopping us. No, and also Germany and Italy are like, huh, no one stopped them either. Where's this League of Nations actually supposed to be? So the United States, though, does have a response for Japan. And we basically lay out what's called the Stimson Doctrine, Stimson. And the Stimson Doctrine said to Japan, hey, you need to honor our previous naval agreements, and we will not recognize you taking over Manchuria. And lo and behold, this really doesn't work, okay? And Japan continues to imperialize into China and some of the other territories along that region. Now, how the heck does Japan manage to take control of this is a really good question. China is relatively weak at this point in the 1920s and 30s because they are between dynasties. They are also between leadership. You have Chiang Kai-shek, who's going to be one leader of China, who is going to then be challenged by communist Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong ends up with enough of a following of the people in China that he literally chases Chiang Kai-shek over to the island of Taiwan. In Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek sets up a government there, but Mao Zedong has mainland China. But it's this type of turmoil that China is going through that allows Japan to come in, okay? Now, the next part of our US foreign policy at this time is going to be in Latin America. And we are going to continue friendly relations with Latin America. FDR is going to undo some of what Taft and Wilson had established by removing troops from Haiti and Nicaragua. And so he creates what's called his good neighbor policy. And the idea of the good neighbor policy is that we would end up using our commercial interests to help influence the area, that we may not have the big stick policy of Teddy Roosevelt, but we would still use economics to help out. At the Pan American conferences in the early 1930s, we agreed that we wouldn't interfere with Latin America, especially if it was your own civil type of problem. And then in 1936, we also say that, hey, Europe, like we are still involved in Latin America, and so don't try to influence here. Now, specifically Cuba and Mexico as part of our Latin American agreements, okay? In Cuba, we nullify the Platt Amendment. Platt has two T's in it. Now, keep in mind the Platt Amendment had been from the Spanish-American War in 1898, and that had given the United States the rights to help intervene in Cuba. And Roosevelt nullifies this and takes away that influence, but we are going to maintain our military base at Guantanamo Bay. For Mexico, there are going to be problems with our oil companies that are drilling in Mexico. And the oil companies are basically mistreating the employees and mistreating the area. And the president of Mexico, Cardenas, wants the United States out. And the US oil companies go to FDR and say, hey, we need you to intervene. And FDR said, no, I'm not intervening, and I encourage you to negotiate with Mexico. So then the Soviet Union recognition, okay, is just that in 1933, FDR does recognize the Soviet Union as a viable nation. And we are basically looking at, we're going to start trading with them because we're in this depression and we need all the trade allies we can have. So then we have looking at some of the military leaders of the, the European leaders during World War II. And looking at first Francisco Franco, he is shown raising his hand here in the top left image. Francisco Franco is going to become the fascist leader of Spain through the Spanish Civil War. And it was the fascists against the loyalists. And for it, a fascism is an authoritarian system where you combine both politics and economics together. And basically looking at trying to glorify your nation and your race, okay? So if you dive more deep into the world history of it, the European history of it, you would find out that Germany basically allies with Franco and uses the Spanish Civil War as a way to test out some of his new military equipment, okay? And what you then have as far as a response, the Soviet Union supports the loyalists. Germany and Italy support Franco, the fascists. Okay, the United States stays out of it. We refuse to get involved. However, there are some Americans who do go in as volunteers. And they are known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And that's why I have this Abraham Lincoln pin on here, okay? The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was volunteers, and they were incredibly diverse racially, economically, and occupationally. About 900 people were Jewish, 80 to 100 were Black. One volunteer was a Texas Ranger, one was a ballet dancer, and 3 others were acrobats. So I kind of laugh because I'm sure those skill sets came in handy for the war, right? But out of nearly 3,000 people that served in the brigade, nearly a third of them died in combat because they were ill-trained and they were on the front lines for 120 consecutive days. And they had really no impact, though, against Franco's regime. Now, the painting on the bottom, you may also recognize as being by Pablo Picasso, an abstract artist. And what this image is his depiction of the aerial bombings that were used for the first time on civilians during the Spanish Civil War. And this takes place at Guernica. So then Benito Mussolini on the right here is the fascist leader of Italy. And he gains power in Italy around 1922. His support base are going to be war veterans, nationalists, and people that are anti-communist. Okay. What he did was he took advantage of the post-World War I crises by looking at the labor strikes that were occurring, the breakdown of law and order, the arguments, the battles between left and right-wing groups. And so he basically takes this authoritarian control over Italy. And an example of one thing that he did was he actually outlawed labor unions because he believed that it promoted the interests of the individual laborer instead of the nation of Italy itself. So then let's talk about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was a World War I veteran. And he actually had in 1923 attempted a government revolt, but it was unsuccessful and he ended up in jail. It was while he was in jail that he ended up writing his book, Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf becomes the base of literature for the Nazi Party, basically stating that Germany had not been beaten during World War I, that traitors gave in too soon, and that the Germans were stabbed in the back by Jews, Catholics, communists, and labor unions. So he began to rebuild Germany and unite people using his speeches and intimidation. And he becomes the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He convinces people that the Germans, with their defeat in World War I, the humiliating peace terms, and the collapse of their economy was all because of poor political leadership and the economic machinations or manipulations of the Jewish population. So the people who listened to him were young, they were unemployed, they were maybe merchants whose businesses had been destroyed between the war and the Depression, and they started to terrorize the opposing parties. So he begins to indoctrinate the people by stating about the master race, that Germans were superior by blood, that they were chosen to rule the world. And he also goes after the youth by creating what's known as the Hitler Youth and going into schools and creating propaganda and doing military style exercises. He also controlled businesses, destroyed unions, and also controlled the churches. And then, of course, it goes in after the Jewish people. Now, as far as the Jewish people go, keep in mind that they were forced to wear yellow stars of David on the outside of their clothing, and that their businesses had been ruined in an event called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And also they were put in ghettos. So if you remember, for a quick moment, pause on this terminology, right? If you remember when we studied Jacob Riis and some of the progressive era movements, how I said I really didn't like tenements being called ghettos. This is why. Ghettos, as far as the term goes, it's been around for centuries, okay? And in this case, Jews and other people were forcibly moved to ghettos, and they were surrounded by fences. They were monitored 24/7, and all of their whereabouts and happenings were controlled. And it is from these ghettos that a lot of people were then deported either to work camps or labor camps and concentration camps. The concentration camps are known as the death camps, okay? And I just want to differentiate some of this terminology because when you study our home front, you will realize that the United States did what we call internment or relocation camps. And I would put them similar to like the ghettos, where we forcibly removed the Japanese people and moved them into an isolated area and had them monitored. Okay. So I just want to make sure you understand that the internment camps are not, for the Japanese Americans, are not the death camps that people were sent to in Europe. So talking about the Japanese expansionism, okay, keep in mind that in Japan, they were not necessarily fascist, okay, like we see in Europe, but they were rather more nationalistic and very militaristic, okay? Now, I had previously mentioned that they had started off in 1931 by taking Manchuria, which is shown on the map in the pink, okay? And then you have further expansion into some of this yellow and green territory within China, okay? So Japan pursues a very aggressive foreign policy by taking over and invading other areas. So you have two key events that both happen in December of 1937. The first one to talk about is the rape of Nanking or Nanjing. And then the second one will be the USS Panay incident, both again taking place in December of 1937. So as a heads up, the rape of Nanking is a bit unsettling. What the Japanese troops did was they went into Nanking, which at the time was the capital of China, and went in, and it was 6 weeks of mass murder, massive rape, and mass destruction of the city and the residents of Nanking. The soldiers of the Japanese army murdered and disarmed people. There is documentation, I guess you could say, or stories that Japanese officers held competitions as to how many people they could decapitate. There is a question as to the number of people that were impacted, whether through rape, through murder, and the widespread destruction. There's discrepancy between the numbers. On the low side, people say about 40,000 people were affected, and on the high side, about 300,000. The reason for the numeric difference is because most of the Japanese military records were destroyed towards the end of the war. And then during a military tribunal, after the war ended, there was a question about, at the crimes tribunal, there was a question about the estimates, okay, that China had given as well. So this goes on for about 6 weeks. But in the beginning of this, around December 13th, you then have, or December 12th, you have then the attack by the Japanese on a US gunboat, the Panay. And the Panay, just to tell a bit of the story here, okay? The Panay is a gunboat, which means it is not a particularly big boat. And they were going through in the Yangtze River to go get our oil men. Okay, we had the Standard Oil Company there, and the Panay was under the instructions that they had to go extract the men from the Standard Oil Company and to stop them from drilling oil and bring them home. But this is where it gets really weird. It's one of those of like, you mean to tell me one gunboat goes into a Japanese controlled area of China without any sort of protection under the auspice of removing US civilians? And the answer is yes. But we end up getting attacked. And Japan then later on says, oh, like, we're sorry, our bad. We didn't see that it was labeled as a USS boat. We're sorry, here's $2 million. Now, 3 Americans did die and 30 more were wounded. And FDR did believe that Japan had authorized the attack, that this, like, oh, we're sorry, we didn't see it, was of course a lie. But at the same time, knowing that it was one gunboat going alone to remove Americans, it begs the question, like, what were we really doing there? And it was a bit of FDR testing the waters to see what type of reaction Japan's going to do. And based on Japan's attack, it turns into a bit of a pissing match, being like, okay, Japan's marking their territory, saying, no, this is our land, get out, we are defending what we have now taken. And that's the type of reaction we had kind of needed to see. Now, it does not bring us into war yet, but it does start to build up the anti-Japanese sentiment in America. So then the League of Nations failures. Obviously, with the League of Nations not reacting to Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, they don't react when you have the rape of Nanking in 1937. And so the League of Nations is crumbling on itself because it's not able to enforce any of its peacekeeping duties. In 1935 specifically, Mussolini goes into Ethiopia. And to show you a bit of a map here, so here's Italy, your boot, here's Ethiopia, and Italy is going into Ethiopia and Somalia in 1935, looking for oil, okay? And then, and other raw materials. And then Germany goes into the Rhineland area. And so the Rhineland area is this part shaded, and it's the territory that was supposed to be demilitarized between France, Germany, and Belgium. And this is the same area that Germany had attacked and expanded into in the very beginning of World War I. So this kind of puts everyone on alarm, but Hitler's like, oh, we just wanted this one area, we'll back off now and won't do anything further. Right. So what ends up happening then at home, why are we still not involved in anything and how neutral are we really? A lot of it goes back to the isolationist sentiment that we then see build up because of this WWII committee. So US Senator Gerald Nye from North Dakota opens this investigation as to what really brought us into World War I, and he begins to change the narrative. And he doesn't believe that it's, Wilson wanted to keep the world safe for democracy, that America wanted to help out our allies. He thought it was actually because of war profits. And so the Senate committee, known as the Senate Munitions Committee, or informally the WWII Committee, are basically going in and investigating that the US entry into World War I was a mistake, and that really it was based on the greed of bankers and weapons manufacturers. And what's instrumental in coming out from this is that it adds to this isolationist attitude, saying that the United States shouldn't get involved in foreign affairs, but then also that Congress will now have to play a larger role in determining when and how we go to war. Also, you will see when I talk about the Neutrality Acts, how this committee and talking about the profiteering that came from it and known in people that were known as the merchants of death, how they're going to be curbed a bit in our early stages of involvement in the war. The cartoon that I have up here is from Dr. Seuss, and Dr. Seuss recently has come under attack for his racist and other inappropriate themes. And about 6 of his books will no longer be published because of that. So I would just like to forewarn you that between this slide and your home front work, you will see further Dr. Seuss cartoons because he was part of the war machine. And also there's a time and place, and this was considered appropriate at the time, but by today's standards, it is not. Okay, so just as a heads up. Now, the isolationist attitude that we see from the WWII committee and from before, and we see emerge again with the Neutrality Acts, okay? We are going to keep us further from involvement and dictate more as a policy, okay? But listen to the specifics on these Neutrality Acts. 1935, we were to prohibit all arms or weapons shipments and forbid US citizens from traveling on ships of belligerent nations. Belligerent nations means aggressive nations or nations that are at war. So we're not allowing the shipment of weapons. 1936, we forbid the extension of any loans to belligerent nations. 37, we forbid the shipment of weapons to any side in the Spanish Civil War. And especially that one from 35 and 36 specifically go to Nye's committee. And what he found and what he believed brought us into World War I, that people were profiteering off of selling weapons to Europe, and the banks were profiteering off of extending loans to Europeans to pay for the war, okay? So then we beg the question, though, of how neutral is neutral, okay? And our opinion begins to shift, obviously, after Nanking and the USS Panay incident of being anti-Japanese, but now we're starting to go definitely more favorably towards the British, okay? So the cash and carry policy of 1939 said basically that any war material and equipment could be sold to any nation, including belligerent nations, okay? But the catch is you had to move the items using your own ships. And the United States had to be paid immediately in cash, and you would assume all the risk with the transportation. And so this cash and carry, come over to the United States, load up your ships, good luck, right? Basically favored, though, Great Britain and France, because they were the only ones that could control the sea and get across the Atlantic Ocean at the time. So then we have the draft, okay? And the draft in September of 1940 was the first peacetime draft that we had ever had for the United States. And in FDR's speech explaining to the American people why we had it, he said it was for defensive measures only, okay? At first, the draft was for men aged 21 to 35. And then as the war got started, we extended it to 18 to 45, okay? And so we see the first peacetime draft with the Selective Service Act. So then the destroyers for bases flat out ignores any sort of neutrality that we have had, okay? And in September of 1940, we send 50 old US Navy destroyers, which are ships, and give them to Britain. What do we get? Caribbean land rights, okay? So for 50 ships, old ships, we get these Caribbean locations shown on the map on the right. The deal with that is then we were gathering these areas and being able to use these Navy bases. So that way we could also help protect from the Caribbean side our Panama Canal, okay? So then lastly is the Lend-Lease Act. And the Lend-Lease Act overrode any earlier neutrality act, overrode also the Cash Carry Act. This is March of 41, so still before we're at war. But this was an act to promote the defense of the United States. And we would give Free France, Great Britain, China, later Soviet Union, food, oil, and any other war materials that they may have needed. It was mostly for free because they were essentially buying it on credit. And some warships were returned after the war because the idea of lend-lease is you return what you have borrowed, right? But we were also given property leases on Army and Navy bases in Allied territory for the war, which is the map you then see on the left. How it was described to people for the Lend-Lease Act was that it was essentially like lending a neighbor a garden hose when they have a house fire. So in the midst of this all, FDR goes for a third term election, okay? And if you recall the 1932 and 1936 election, FDR swept the nation, right? But we start to see a change in 1940. So in the election of 1940, FDR runs again, but instead of running with his previous vice president, John Nance Garner, he runs instead with Henry Wallace. The reason why Roosevelt gives up on Garner is because Garner and he begin to differ on how to handle things like the New Deal programs. Garner, remember, had been from Texas. He was a Southerner. And even though he was a Democrat, he was a bit more conservative and did not like all of the civil rights and civil liberties work that FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt were doing with the New Deal programs. So Henry Wallace had been Secretary of Agriculture, and actually he's from here in Iowa. He still has the Wallace family home in Sherman Hill area in Des Moines, and then they also have a farm still. The Republicans put up Wendell Willkie, who had actually never run for a public office before, but he ran an energetic campaign specifically trying to focus the Republican base in the Midwest and the Northeast. Now, he criticized FDR for the incompetence and like waste of the New Deal programs, warns against the danger of breaking the two-term tradition, and then also accuses FDR of wanting to secretly bring the United States into the war. But Willkie's image and his association with big businesses is what hurt him during the election. Voters blamed still the corporations and business leaders for the onset of the Great Depression, and Willkie was associated with that. And so really he could only pull a bit of the Midwest. Now, not on your notes, but just as a side note, okay, FDR gives a State of the Union address in the beginning of 41, and it is known as the Four Freedoms speech. And it is said that we should, as America, be lending money to Great Britain to purchase war materials based on our defense of four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of want, or freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Artist Norman Rockwell then captured these as images to go along with the Four Freedoms speech. So what eventually brings us into war, more specifically prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, is we see the world blow up in Europe, okay? We see in September of 1938, the Munich appeasement. The Munich appeasement was between Great Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. And what Germany does is take the Sudetenland area, which is kind of part of this curved area near Prague and Czechoslovakia. They then also take part of Austria as what's known as Anschluss. And if you are familiar with the movie Sound of Music, It is when the captain and Maria come back from their honeymoon and they rip down the Nazi flag. That's part of Anschluss. Okay, just side note, pop culture reference for you. Okay. So in the Munich Agreement, the idea was Hitler saying, oh, we promise we'll just take the Sudetenland. We promise we won't take any more. We'll be fine. Thank you. And they give him the land. It's the appeasing of Hitler. And of course, it backfires on us because then they take Austria, they take Czechoslovakia, and on from there. September 1st, 1939, Blitzkrieg, which is lightning war against Poland. Poland then runs to Great Britain and France, and we end up in a full-blown war. In June of 1940, France has already fallen to Adolf Hitler, though. So some other things of note, just realize that in this time period, okay, in August of 1939, Soviet Union and Germany had actually signed a non-aggression pact. And the idea behind that non-aggression pact was Hitler promising not to attack the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union liked that because they were like, dude, we had just been attacked during World War I. We don't want to be attacked again. Hitler liked it because he could then focus on Western Europe and conquering from there. Now, you can tell from this timeline a bit of the buildup. 1940, Italy goes into Egypt. They officially form the tripartite axis between Italy, Germany, and Japan. And then in 1941 is where the United States then gets involved in the war. So the lead up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, okay, deals with economics and economic sanctions. The United States had started to put economic holds on Japanese exports. Okay, we stopped selling them raw materials like steel and scrap iron. Okay, and Japan's reaction was saying that that's unfriendly. And because the United States has cut us off from raw materials that we need, we will go ahead out and conquer areas like into China that we can get the materials from. So as time goes on, by mid-1941, FDR then also freezes all of Japan's financial assets in the United States. And what then ends up happening is in November of 1941, Japan and the United States try to negotiate, okay? And November 8th, we realize now that Japan began to plan their attack on Pearl Harbor. But then you have on, let me grab my notes real quick. On November 26th, you have Japan's ambassadors to the United States working with the United States and our Secretary of State Hull, Cordell Hull. And we say in this Hull note, Hull, that we are willing to start selling you your materials again. Okay, we will give you supplies if you stop imperializing and remove yourself from China and other areas. That was our condition. You have to stop and remove yourself. And suddenly Japan pulls back all of their ambassadors and negotiations stop. And then lo and behold, a week later, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the deal with Pearl Harbor, this is December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. I will send you these video links, both of them, but I really like especially the History Channel one because it does a really nice job. It actually shows it, you hear FDR's speech, but then it shows some live footage from the era. Okay, so realize that the attack on Pearl Harbor Sunday morning, 8 of our battleships were sunk or damaged. 2,403 people were killed. 188 airplanes damaged or shot down, and we lost 18 ships as well. Now, the people that died, about half of them were on the USS Arizona, and the Arizona is still the one ship, the one battleship that we could not resurrect. The rest of which we were actually able to lift back up because Pearl Harbor is relatively shallow, and we were able to repair the other 7 battleships. Now, Japan lost 353 fighter planes, 29 airplanes, 5 submarines, and 62 men. Japan made some mistakes in their attacks. They did not attack the dockyards. they went for the battleships instead. And because of that, we could still repair things. Also, they attacked our battleships, which were not our aircraft carriers. And this was going to end up being an air war in the Pacific, not a battleship war. Okay. So that takes us to the United States entering into World War II and the end of my information for you. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for listening.